Today is Baptism of the Lord Sunday in our liturgical calendar. So let me invite you this morning to hear Matthew's account of the baptism of Jesus as it comes to us in the third chapter of his gospel, chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bibles, I'd invite you to do so at this time in the New Testament on page 784. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." The word of the Lord. I do not typically begin a sermon with tabloid gossip. However, I was struck this week when Prince Harry and Meghan decided to, quote, step back as senior members of the royal family, deciding to split their time between Britain and North America. No matter what else lies behind that decision, it sounds to me like Meghan and Harry don't want to be told how to live their lives. In other words, they don't want to be told, this is who you ought to be. Do you recognize that feeling? Can we all relate to that feeling of resistance to somebody else telling us, this is who you ought to be? In the Pulitzer Prize-winning play Fences, Troy Maxson is a garbage collector in the 1950s, as well as a former Negro League baseball player. Troy is having difficulties with his son, Corey. Corey is a star high school football player with a chance to go to college on a scholarship, but Troy has reservations about his son pursuing football. You see, Troy believes that he was kept out of Major League Baseball because of the color of his skin, and he still sees the racism that is prevalent in professional sports. And whether it's because he doesn't want his own son to experience the kind of bigotry that he did, or whether it's because he's secretly afraid that his son will actually be good enough to succeed in sports and overcome that bigotry, whatever the answer is, Troy tells his son that he has to work a part-time job in order to stay on the football team. And when football practice gets in the way of his son working that job, Troy tells the coach to remove Corey from the team. This, of course, leads to confrontation between father and son, all of which boils over when finally Troy kicks Corey out of the house. Well, by the end of the play, Corey has joined the Marine Corps, and after 6 years away from home, he finally comes back when he learns that his father has died of a heart attack. Corey, though, is still mad at his father, and he tells his mother that even though he's home, he's not going to his father's funeral. To which his mother says, "Not going to your daddy's funeral ain't gonna make you a man." To which Corey says, "The whole time I was growing up, living in this house, Papa was like a shadow that followed you everywhere. It weighed on you and sunk into your flesh. It would wrap around you and lay there until you couldn't tell which one was you anymore. I've got to find a way to get rid of that shadow, Mama." "You just like him," his mother says. "You Troy Maxson all over again." "I don't want to be Troy Maxson," Corey replies. "I want to be me." Now, why does that scene work? We know why it works. folks. We all have ideas about who we ought to be, and we want the freedom to live those out. I raise all this morning because of our text. We just heard Matthew's account of the baptism of Jesus. And according to Matthew, it's only in Matthew, there's a small disagreement between John the Baptist and Jesus before Jesus is baptized. Matthew writes, John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus replies, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. In other words, John does not get to decide at that moment who he will be in our text. He will be the one who baptizes Jesus. He gets told by Jesus, this is who you are. This is who you have to be. It may sound like a small detail, not a big deal, but I think in each of our lives, this can be a really big deal. Have you ever been told by somebody, this is who you have to be? How does it feel when that happens? It kind of rubs us the wrong way, right? Why does it rub us the wrong way? Because we get taught from an early age, we can be whoever we set our minds to be. When I was a teenager, I heard George Perlis, the former coach of the Michigan State football team, he told his players, work hard, keep your mouths shut, good things will happen. And that Michigan State football team went to the Rose Bowl in 1987 for the first time in decades. In other words, with hard work and discipline, you and I can be whoever you set out to be. Speaking of college football, I understand there's a big game going on tomorrow evening. What do you think would happen if I told all the Clemson fans in our congregation, so sorry, your pastor had a divine revelation last night. God says, even though you've traveled to New Orleans or been rooting for Clemson your entire life, you have to root for LSU tomorrow. Yeah, right. They would ignore me at best. Some might accuse me of speaking blasphemy. I'll tell you what would not happen. They would not suddenly switch sides. When it comes to football, no one's going to tell you who you are, right? No one's going to tell you who you have to be. Do you have that feeling in your mind right now? That feeling of resistance to somebody telling you who you have to be? Good, good. Let's look again at the baptism of Jesus. You see, at his baptism, it's not just John that gets told. Jesus is told, this is who you are. This is who you have to be. When Jesus emerges from the water, what does the voice from heaven say? Does God say, I have an offer for you, Jesus, about the way you might want to live your life? The upside is that there will be healing and preaching and miracles, and you'll change the world forever. Of course, there's this downside called suffering and the cross, but the upside is really, really good. What do you think, Jesus? Will you be my beloved son? Is that what God says? No, that's not what God says. God says, this is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Do you see what's going on? God says to Jesus when he's coming up out of the water, my beloved child, this is who you are. Has somebody ever told you that? And it wasn't a bad thing. It was, in fact, when that person told you a helpful thing. I'm reminded of a conversation I had shortly after graduating from college. I was serving with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps for a year as a paralegal for a poverty law agency. During that year, I was trying to decide whether or not to go to law school. At the time, I was 22 years old, and becoming a pastor was not at all on my radar screen. over the Christmas break that year, I went back home to Michigan and had lunch with the pastor at my home church there. "How do you like what you're doing?" he asked me. "It's okay," I said. "I like this. I don't like that." "Well, you don't sound terribly excited," he replied. "Well, I don't know," I replied. I don't know what I want to do next year. Do I go to law school? Do I spend thousands of dollars putting myself in debt? I don't know if I want to practice law. I don't know what kind of law I would find satisfying. Now, at this point in that kind of conversation, most pastors take the approach of being very pastoral, right? What do you like about law? What gifts do you feel you have? Ask good questions that help an individual like me go back home and figure it out for myself. That's not what my home pastor did. He took a very different approach. He said, "You need to go to seminary." "I need to do what?" "You need to go to seminary," he said. "You need to be a pastor. I can see it in you. I've seen it for years, Ben. You need to go to seminary." I said something like, "There's no way in heck I'm going to seminary." But my pastor was persistent. After that lunch, he sent me an application form. He contacted the admissions director at one of our denomination's seminaries, and before I knew it, the form was filled out, the decision was made, and I was on my way. Do you see what I'm getting at? If my home church pastor had just said, "Ben, figure it out for yourself," if he had not told me over lunch, "Ben, this is who you are," I don't know if I would be standing here before you this morning. Is it always bad news when somebody says, "This is who you are"? I mean, it can be, right? It can be. When an immigrant or a refugee gets told that they don't belong here in this country because of the color of their skin or their religion or their politics or simply because they were not born here, it is not a blessing for somebody to say to them with misguided judgment, "You're not one of us. This is who you really are." I'm not talking about those times. I'm talking about the times when all of us need to be reminded of who we really are. Those times when we need to be reminded of the identity given to us by God at our baptisms. A number of years ago, a Presbyterian pastor named John Galloway lost his wife, Susan, to Lou Gehrig's disease, to ALS. Afterward, he spoke with some friends about that experience. One of his friends recalls what John said. John said that his wife's body had deteriorated slowly, but not her spirit, not ever. Near the end, when she was paralyzed completely, unable to speak, communicating by typing with one finger on her computer, their friends decided to have a party for her. They ate and drank and told stories and laughed and cried, and each person said what they wanted to say to Susan and about Susan. At the end of the evening, before her guests left, she typed on her computer screen so they all could read, "This has been the best year of my life, to know how much you are loved." Wait, what? I would have thought she would have said it was the worst year. Getting sick, watching her body fade. She said it was the best year because all her friends had said to her, "This is who you are. You are not your disease. You are Susan. You are our friend. You are deeply, deeply loved." Has that ever happened to you? Has someone ever reminded you that you are deeply loved and that is who you are? It's what happens during our baptism. In our baptisms, God tells us that no matter what difficulty you may be going through right now, you are God's child. No matter what uncertainty exists in your life right now, God will never let go of you because God has claimed you as God's very own. It is very much like what happened at the baptism of Jesus. The baptism of Jesus is instructive, I think, for all of us. At his baptism, Jesus is told who he is. This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. But I think as Jesus reflected, as he reflected on those words throughout his ministry, I think he heard a bit more than simply the assurance that God would always love him. Look, I know we're a little late in the sermon right now, but y'all up for some Bible study? Just nod your head with me that you all are up for some Bible study. You see, when Jesus heard those words at his baptism, the first part of that statement, "This is my Son, the beloved," that's an echo of Psalm 2, which is a royal psalm to be used at the coronation of Israel's king. And Jesus would have recognized that. And the second part of the statement, "with whom I am well pleased," that's an echo of Isaiah 42, the text we heard today, which is known as a servant song in Isaiah. And Jesus would have recognized that too. At his baptism, Jesus is told by God that he will be a king, royalty, God's son. And yet he will be a king unlike other kings, a king who serves, a king who suffers. And that places both a blessing and a calling on Jesus' life. And it's all mixed up together, which I think is true not just for Jesus, but for us as well. That mixture of calling and blessing that we receive at our baptism. Have you ever thought about that before? Ann Tyler once wrote a novel about a young man named Ian Bedlow. Ian is about to graduate from high school. He's got a good-looking girlfriend who loves him. He's footloose and fancy-free, and he plans to go to college. But then tragedy strikes the family. Ian's older brother dies, and his brother's wife dies soon after that, and there are suddenly 3 young children from his brother's family to take care of. Ian's sister-in-law had no family. Ian's family, they have become the only family for those 3 kids. But Ian's parents, they're too old to raise those children. And Ian's sister, she's got a family of her own. By default, the job of raising those 3 children falls to 18-year-old Ian. He decides that raising the kids is what God really wants him to do, what God has called him to do, even though it means giving up his plans for college and losing his girlfriend and losing the future that all of his friends are going to have. And although he believes he's doing what God wants him to do, that doesn't mean he enjoys it all the time. One day, he picks up the youngest of the kids, who's not even 2 years old at the time, and she feels so heavy in his arms, like a weight, like a burden in his life. But Ian raises those kids, and the years go by. At the end of the novel, Ian is a 42-year-old man who has raised those 3 children to adulthood. And he finally decides that the time is right to get married. And he's hesitant about having more kids with his new wife. After all, he's been through it all once before. But they do end up having a baby. And there's a wonderful scene at the end of the novel when he picks that new child up. And he holds the child, and the child feels light. Not heavy at all. Not a burden at all, just a gift. The responsibility and burden of parenting has become a gift. Saint Maybe is the name of the novel. It's a wonderful novel, but Ian Bedlow is not the person I'm curious about today. the people I'm interested in are right here in this room. The reformer Martin Luther once said, "Remember your baptism." He didn't mean remember all the details of the day. He meant remember this is who you are. The next time you remember who you are and you set about working for justice, the next time you remember who you are and you spend time helping formerly incarcerated individuals adapt into society once again, the next time you remember who you are and let go of a grudge, the next time you remember your baptism and forgive someone who's difficult to forgive, the next time you pick up somebody else's cross and carry it for them, the next time you remember your baptismal identity, the one that God has given you, will it feel like a burden? Or do you think God might bless you in ways that you could never see coming?